Welcome to episode 8 of the Informing Choices mini-pod. The future of work is one of those subjects that has been covered regularly by futurists and organisational development specialists over the years. But the pandemic has brought many developments into where and how we work into sharp focus. Things like increasing automation, home and remote working versus office-based working, for example, are things that we're talking about more and more. So to talk about the future of the way we work, I'm delighted to welcome change leader Rob Caldera to the podcast. Rob, welcome to the podcast. I'm acutely aware I've grossly oversimplified what you do. So do tell us a bit more about your focus and your business.
Well, first off, Steve, thank you for inviting me to participate in your podcast. I'm excited to be here today. So as to me, I'm an independent consultant, owner of Future Shift Consulting, which is an organizational change management, communications, and strategic foresight firm, which I've been running for almost 5 years now. The focus of my work is helping organizations anticipate and navigate change, prepare them basically for the future of work, which we're going to talk about. So between my experience as a consultant and the 2 decades plus of working within organizations prior to that, I've worked in a number of different industries, ranging from pharmaceutical to financial, engineering and construction, and more. But the theme throughout my career in each of those industries has been driving internal change, which is how I came to do change management consulting and why I've been exploring the future of work for basically longer than it's been a buzzword. And in recent years, I added the discipline of strategic foresight to my repertoire. Of course, given how fast things are changing these days, I felt that it was extremely important to better understand and explore the future. And I wanted to be able to help organizations do this so that they can get a better handle on all the crazy disruptive change constantly coming at them. And of course, nothing's been more disruptive than this pandemic, which I think is a good segue, right, to what we're going to talk about today.
I couldn't have done that better myself. So to kick this off, in the aftermath of the pandemic, we're calling it the 2020 pandemic. I guess it's going to be with us for longer than that. But how might companies change the way they work so that they become more resilient and responsive to sudden disruptive events? Because there are lessons to be learned here, aren't there?
Definitely, yes. And that question, that's basically like the $64,000 question, as they say, isn't it? Or maybe these days it's 64 million. I don't know. Well, first of all, I'll say there's no silver bullet to doing this, right? There's no quick fix. Companies need to recognize that making their organizations more resilient and responsive to change requires basically a paradigm shift when it comes to how they typically manage change today. And I think they could start by recognizing that you can't really manage change, not when it's as fast and disruptive as what we're talking about. But you can build an organization that is more change ready, so that it can essentially roll with the punches better. So to be able to do that, and in the interest of time, since I know this is a mini pod, I'll mention just 3 key things that I think can help build this kind of change readiness we're talking about. So number 1, and Steve, I know you'll appreciate this one. I believe organizations should introduce the practice of foresight into their strategic planning efforts. This, I feel, will help them get a better handle on the possible changes and the future scenarios that they'll face. I mean, the future is coming so fast at us more than ever, and foresight can help model a number of different yet plausible scenarios to prepare for. It's like having maps for multiple possible destinations, and even the act of doing this will help you help you prepare, I guess, better for whatever happens. The second change I see is, and this I think is the biggest part of the transformation that I'm talking about, is for companies to build the operational model that will enable change agility, which involves designing a framework for facilitating change on an ongoing basis, from accelerating how employees connect, communicate, and collaborate so that they can be much more responsive, and doing this through the use of digital tools and even AI, to also how your organization is structured, moving to a distributed network model that basically ditches the traditional hierarchy in favor of autonomous self-managing teams. And with a high percentage of those would have contingent workers. And that would allow for rapid decentralized decision-making to occur. And along with that, I think you'll also need specialized coaching and employee development programs as part of this framework to help employees shift to these new ways of working so that it could foster traits, as you mentioned, such as resiliency, autonomy, adaptability, that we're talking about here. And finally, the third point I want to make in this is what's needed, I think, is a change in leadership style. So if you're going to make all the other changes I mentioned, then the prevalent leadership style in your organization needs to change too. Leaders need to have a mindset that's much more open, ready for different possibilities, one that's aligned with the type of foresight thinking that I mentioned. Yeah. Plus, they certainly need to shed any notions of heavy-handed command and control ways of leading in favor of an approach that's more empowering and coaching-like, especially if they're going to lead in a distributed environment. And they also must be able to readily change and adapt their style, their way of leading to match whatever the situation calls for. So I call sort of like the combination of all those different traits, anticipatory change leadership, essentially. So those are the three key things: strategic foresight, a change readiness model, and anticipatory change leadership.
You know, the thing that immediately jumps out at me when you talk through those three things is it's very easy to get sucked into the technology could be the tool that helps us facilitate this change. And of course, it is a useful tool. But the critical things there were very human things, weren't they? They were about culture. They were about behavior. They were about human centricity of change. And that feels like it is a bit of a shift.
Definitely. And it's kind of ironic, I think, as we're moving towards this world of AI and so much high technology, the direction organizations need to go is the opposite. We need to become more human. We've kind of been more too robotic, not in technology, but in just the way we sort of operate. So we need to actually become more human in order to survive going forward, I guess.
Yeah. So what's your sense about how remote working will evolve? We've got used to doing that a bit more maybe than through the pandemic, although it was certainly a trend we were already starting to see. So do you think remote working will become the norm rather than the exception post-pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it will, but I think possibly not as fast as people think. Like you said, we've slowly been heading in that direction of remote work for a long time now, but the pandemic obviously threw everyone into it very fast. So when things get back to normal, whatever the new normal is, I think we might see a surge, a bounce back of people going back to the office simply because they're just so sick of being home. However, I think that will be short-lived. The pandemic showed that organizations that can be just as productive, using remote work, which means they can get by with a lot less real estate footprint. So money will drive this shift as it does everything else. But I think similarly, employees, once the initial excitement, quote unquote, of getting out of the house passes, they'll realize that things have changed for good, right? I mean, they might miss or eventually miss the work from home lifestyle they created that probably will, they feel lets them get more done, both personally and professionally, gave them a lot more freedom. They may also find that not all of their colleagues decided to come back to the office, so it won't be the same. And then plus they might even have some hesitations being around large groups of people day in and day out, since we've become so accustomed now to that, and hey, COVID's not the only disease. It's probably not the last pandemic. And we're all a lot more aware of disease transmission now. So things will definitely not go back to the way they were.
So how do you think that potentially changes corporate culture, where we might be working more remotely, at the role of contingent workers, in distributed autonomous teams and so on? How does that change the culture, and how does the kind of social culture of organizations in the past survive and thrive, or does it need to?
That's a good question. I think that's an important question too, because all the changes we're discussing can have the effect of whittling away at corporate culture, right? I mean, especially since so much of what feels like culture to us happens when people are together in person. And of course, bringing in so many outsiders like contingent workers that I mentioned earlier, that'll further dissipate those cultural bonds. I mean, as a result, I think many cultures won't survive. In those companies, if they continue on, they'll become shells of themselves. The lack of coherent culture will impact their brand and their image. It eventually sink them. And we could see a lot of well-established companies, go under during this transition period. But I think to cope with that, companies, I mean, that's where the whole employee development aspect I mentioned of building this model before comes into play, right? It's important if your employees can learn to adapt to an environment of accelerated change, then the elements of culture that are basically within them, the sort of the intangibles that they carry from transaction to transaction, those intangibles might come along for the ride too and help maintain the culture. Yeah. And then the culture itself might then even transform with them and get embedded in these new ways of working that they've adopted. And then all the contingent workers I mentioned, they'll see this and they may want to adopt to the culture to fit in. But look, I mean, organizations will have to get creative in how they internally communicate and market messaging around core values, which, sort of the heart of the culture, in order to keep it alive in this remote environment. So a lot of communications, a lot of employee development, a lot, well, as we were talking before, a lot more human methods or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, it really connects strongly to what you were talking about earlier on, about changing notions of leadership and the focus on more human centricity.
Exactly.
So one of the critical technologies we often talk about when we have these kind of conversations are artificial intelligence. So what's your sense of how far you think businesses might be willing to push the use of this technology, not only with its benefits, but its potential challenges in terms of organizational culture, I guess?
I think the answer is as far as needed, and then beyond that to see what else they can get out of it. And because that's our nature, right? I mean, competition, capitalism, it'll demand pushing the envelope on this further and further to get more and more advantages out of it, until possibly something could go wrong. Hopefully that something won't be the dawn of the Matrix or Skynet.
Yeah, let's hope not.
Let's hope not. And while I'm joking, of course, I mean, I really don't see any limit to where this can go, but I think the real problem, of course, won't be artificial intelligence that kills people, but rather AI that kills jobs, right? And I think, unfortunately, that will get pushed very far. But at some point, at least I feel, organizations will realize that they must find, or they must kind of come to their own, some sort of equilibrium between the use of AI and having enough humans left to maintain the essence of who they are. But before that happens, I think there'll be a lot of sort of painful disruption in every industry, which is why organizations and people need to be change ready. to bring it back to that. I will say the one caveat I thought of is that this assumes that there are no major transformations in government and capitalism as we know it that could completely change the concept of work and the extent we need to work, right? But that's a whole nother discussion.
That'll need longer than 15 minutes, that's for sure.
Yes.
So finally, what's your sense then of the implications of these observations to leading change programs now? Because I've thought for a long time that a typical change program really does fix today's or yesterday's problem. It doesn't set us up for the future. So what are the implications in leading change programs for the future?
Well, first of all, yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that's been an issue or problem in change management for a while now, is that you're right. It does fix only like what's happened in the past. It doesn't really, it's not too forward thinking. So I think what we're talking about really is a mindset shift here. And it all kind of comes back to what I said at the beginning. Don't focus on trying to manage change, focus on change readiness. And the readiness part is about taking that proactive approach. This doesn't mean abandoning change management either. I mean, you can and you should still use change management for implementing, I feel, like individual projects. If you're doing a system implementation, for example, I mean, those change management practices will still help with the success of projects like that. But when it comes to the larger picture of how your organization handles, all the change it's currently facing and all the change it may expect coming at it in the near future, that's where companies, I feel, really need to make that mindset shift to change readiness. Traditional change management just simply can't, I feel, keep up with the pace of change that we're looking at least not on that scale. Yeah. So that's my perspective. That whole change readiness part is basically my message, if you will.
Change readiness is something that I'll take with me. I really enjoyed that. Rob, thank you so much for taking part in this. Just tell us, how can people get hold of you? How can they connect with you to learn more about what you do?
Sure. Well, of course, people could find me on LinkedIn under Rob Caldera, but also at my website, futureshiftconsulting.com, which hopefully by the time this podcast goes on the air, we'll be done with a major facelift that's currently undergoing. So we'll see.
Very exciting. Rob, thank you once again for taking part, and thank you for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and I hope to see